For most of my life, I thought I was just a perfectionist. I had high standards, I was driven, I was careful with my words because I'm a poet, and I was very interested in getting things right. But the more I heal, the more I realize something kind of uncomfortable. A lot of my perfectionism isn't about excellence. It's about preventing disconnection. Turns out it was my anxious attachment style, wearing a gold star. Hey, I'm Dr. Regina, Ph.D., and this is Divergent Paths, the podcast where we talk about what late-diagnosed neurodivergent adults actually experience and how to work with your brain instead of against it. I also write a weekly newsletter called Nerd Notes, where I share tips and tricks for living a genuine life with your weird and wonderful brain. The link to sign up is in the show notes. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's pretty personal for me. The way perfectionism is directly wired into my anxious attachment style. And I'm going to be really honest and really genuine and pretty vulnerable in this one. For a long time, I didn't realize that my drive to get it right wasn't about standards I was holding myself. It was about creating a sense of safety that I was desperately desiring and not knowing how to get any other way than being perfect. As I've been talking about attachment styles, I haven't really talked about what some of them feel inside. Now, I can talk about anxious attachment very intimately because it is something I am very familiar with. I kind of joke that I'm an anxiously secure attachment style, where I have some secure tendencies, but I also have this overarching anxiety. Talking about what anxious attachment feels like inside is to think about feeling like you're constantly monitoring the emotional weather in whatever situation you're in. This can look like hypervigilance, where you're constantly paying attention to minor shifts in people's tone or demeanor. And you're doing all of that because you kind of have this underlying, or at least for me, I kind of had this underlying swirl of constantly questioning when they were going to leave me. Like when this person or people or group I was in was going to discover that I wasn't who I was presenting myself as, because keep in mind, I masked for most of my life. I was always afraid of that moment of when they would realize that I wasn't who I was presenting myself as. This constant sort of swirl of wanting to keep track of, paying attention to everybody's emotional state, to their energy, to subtle shifts, to the possibility that something might be off. All of this is part of that anxious attachment, and my mask really was built around wanting to try to hide that anxious attachment. I was always trying to service that anticipation. So anxious attachment isn't always about needing constant reassurance. It's often categorized or described as feeling like you're too much, or feeling like you're too clingy, or you're too this or too that. It's really about trying to prevent relational rupture before it happens. It's your brain trying to run 1,000 tiny calculations about how do I keep this connection stable. I haven't mentioned this before, but my understanding of where my attachment style comes from is rooted, as everybody's is, in my younger years. I grew up in a relatively stable household for the most part. There were some aspects of my childhood, on reflection later in life, were not normal because, as I have mentioned on the show before, and I've talked about, my brothers are significantly older than I am. So I was the youngest by 20 years. So there were 3 kids that were all born within 5 years of each other, and then I came along 20 years later. My dad passed away when I was 13. And when I think about the shifts in my life, pretty much everything in my life growing up was defined by before and after my dad died. Before my dad died, I had a very secure attachment. Things were very stable. My dad was a laborer and he worked long hours and, wasn't around a lot because of that. But my mom was, and I had a very stable sort of home life with the two of them. After my dad died, everything sort of shifted. Because I grew up with an emotionally immature mom, there was no real work done for helping me feel secure after my dad died. In part because my mom did not feel secure, but also in part because she just didn't know how to do repair or work like that, or really help me learn how to grieve. That fracturing in my life really set the stage for my anxious attachment and really is where this fear of abandonment that I'm working with stems from. In that lived experience of anxious attachment, it never feels irrational in the moment, or it didn't when I was less healed than I am now. Now I can pick up on it. I'm like, ooh, this is burning a little brighter than it needs to. But when I was not at that point, it never felt like I was being outrageous with what I wanted or what I needed, or feeling like I always thought that my perceptions were exactly what was happening. I took on the emotional responsibility for all of my relationships because I wanted to make sure that I could hold it together because it was so important to me and because I was so afraid of losing connection stemming from my dad dying when I was younger. That's where this piece for perfectionism really came in. I really wanted to prevent that abandonment. And so being perfect became, in this state, a rational approach to keeping myself safe. I wasn't looking for a standard of excellence. I was just trying to avoid the need for repair because I didn't know how to fix things after people got hurt. As I was masking, the pieces of that are that I wanted to avoid being criticized. I wanted to avoid being misunderstood. I wanted to avoid the abandonment or the disconnection. I was always thinking that if something goes wrong in a relationship or in a friend group or whatnot, it's my fault. I have done something wrong here. If I could just avoid that, I felt like I would be safe. That's led to my relationships where I was often in that avoidant and anxious cycle where I was chasing after people who I felt I needed to hold those standards with and wanted to keep kind of going after to make that connection. And I wanted to fix everything. I wanted to fix everything so we didn't have to fix everything. I would apologize when I didn't need to apologize. I would say things were my fault that were my partner's faults. I would do a lot of this type of repair in relationships. It's only now that I have my late diagnosis that I realize how much my neurodivergence was amplifying this connection between the anxious attachment and the perfectionism and really masking. Masking was this performance that I was giving of being neurotypical, being able to do all of the things, right? That in itself was a form of perfectionism because if I could just look like I belonged, then that was what would keep me safe. It would help me avoid feeling rejection. It would help me avoid being corrected on my tone or my enthusiasm over the things that I loved. I would not be a lot if I was perfect, all right? I would be just the right amount, right? Because my diagnosis came at level 49, I internalized for a long time that I was the problem in relationships and friendships, etc. And it has been liberating for me to have the diagnosis because it allows me to look at my life in a way with so much more compassion. And I can look at why I needed and I wanted the perfectionism and I wanted to be perfect so bad because I just didn't understand who I was. All of this, though, comes with such a high cost. Perfectionism is something that just drives you into exhaustion. I mentioned before that it drives you toward hypervigilance. And you end up in long-term relationships, or at least I ended up resenting the people I was in relationships with because I felt like I was doing so much to maintain the connection and they were often doing so little. And if you're with people who can see that and know that they're able to just kind of like sit back and kind of rest on their laurels as you do all the work to maintain the relationship, that definitely builds a lot of resentment. And that's one of the reasons why I had relationships that never really felt solid, because I wanted them to be solid, but I wanted them to be solid without the test of fixing things and needing to repair. The people I was in relationships with before I did this part of my healing, before I got to where I am now that I'm a couple of years past my diagnosis, they were in a relationship with that perfect mask. They were in a relationship with a person who wasn't me. They loved my performance and not who I really was. So moving from that performance and moving from that perfectionism into a secure attachment is not easy work, but it is so valuable. And here are some of the steps that I used personally and that I use with my clients to address this perfectionism that we're using to keep an anxious attachment safe. Separate your standards from survival. Ask yourself, is this excellence I'm striving for? Or am I trying to be perfect out of a sense of fear? Practice some imperfect exposure. Take some small risks. Send a text without editing it a bunch of times. Don't apologize automatically, and don't overly soften your language. And I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you to go out and be a jerk to the people that you love and that you're in relationships with. But if you have an anxious attachment and you tend toward perfectionism and you're good with words like I am, you do have the capacity to say things very softly and very gently. And it takes an exorbitant amount of energy in order to be able to do that. Maybe don't worry about softening your language. Don't go out and be a jerk, but just kind of let your words, maybe they're a little hard. Words can be hard sometimes, and that's okay. Let the people in your life sit with some mild disappointment. Let them sit in that discomfort as well, because overworking to make people feel comfortable all the time doesn't make you more safe. It makes you have relationships that have no foundation in them. I often say this: work on making sure you're regulated before you try to fix or repair things in your relationships. Anxious attachment is always in a hurry. It wants everything done immediately. The thing about having a secure attachment is you can slow down, you can pause, you can work toward regulation when you're activated, you can check your reality, you can check your emotions and start thinking about how your emotions are impacting your reality, and then respond. I've talked about the power in the pause. The pause comes from working toward a secure attachment. And at the base of this, at the very, very base of all of this, you need to work on rewriting your core beliefs in yourself. It's not, if I'm perfect, I'll be safe. It's, I can be imperfect, I can make mistakes, and I can still be chosen by the people who love me, and I can still be safe. So sit with that, sit with some of those core beliefs that may be really difficult for you to think about or address and might make you uncomfortable, because growth generally doesn't come from being comfortable. I know that firsthand. Because now that I recognize that my perfectionism was never really about achievement, it was about keeping myself safe. It was about keeping connected. It was keeping relationships. It was the way I was able to feel like I wasn't messing up, that I wasn't too much, that I wasn't really the problem. Secure attachment isn't earned through being flawless. It's about building it through honesty, about being your genuine self, about removing the mask with the ones you love so they can see who you are. So if this resonates with you and you sometimes feel like you're gold stars are actually armor instead of achievements. This is exactly the kind of pattern I unpack with my clients. There's a link in the show notes to sign up for a clarity call where we can talk about this and maybe some other things that you've been struggling with or working on. I want to leave you with, you're not intense or broken. You're not a lot. You're just the right amount. With your beautiful, weird and wild neurodivergent brain, you are adaptive. And you can build something more secure than the performance of perfection.